Do you think you're smart that you can't be fooled? Well, there was a time when an entire continent believed that a 3 meter tall stone giant was proof of something biblical. Get ready, because today I take you back to 1869, the year a blatant lie became a golden business. A story so ridiculous it's almost brilliant. Imagine America in 1869, an era of great change, of pioneering spirit, but also of a healthy, sometimes naive thirst for wonder. Science was in its infancy, religions were heatedly debating, and people were willing to believe almost anything as long as it was spectacular enough. In a world that was discovering Darwin and his theories of evolution, many still sought confirmation of the biblical narrative, of antediluvian giants, of a glorious and mysterious past. It was fertile ground, a perfect stage for anyone with the audacity to stage a good old fashioned hoax. And believe me, our protagonist certainly had no shortage of audacity. It was a time when every day brought a new invention, a new discovery, a new way of seeing the world, electricity, the railways that knit the country together, cities that grew out of all proportion. People wanted to be amazed, to escape from everyday life, to experience the impossible firsthand, and if the impossible presented itself in the form of a petrified giant, well, so much the better. It wasn't just curiosity that drove people, but also a certain anxiety. Science was challenging age old dogmas, and a biblical giant was a bit of a reassurance, a bridge between the old and the new, an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. In this effervescent and somewhat chaotic landscape, George Hull, a cigar manufacturer from Binghamton, New York, was not just a businessman. He was a shrewd thinker, a lateral thinker, and someone with an innate talent for human psychology. He had witnessed a rather heated argument between a Methodist minister and an atheist over passages in Genesis that mentioned the existence of giants on earth. The minister argued for the literalness of the Bible. The atheist scoffed at such a belief. Hall, listening, did not think who is right, but rather how can I make money from this? And so in his astute mind an idea germinated that would ridicule the gullible and above all line his own pockets. So, armed with a crazy idea and considerable capital, about $12,600 at the time, a significant sum, Hull set his plan in motion. It was not a simple plan, mind you. It wasn't a question of painting a picture or sculpting a statuette. No, Hull thought big. It had to be a giant, a true colossus, who had to look authentic, ancient, and above all, petrified dead. The first step was finding the right material. He chose a huge block of plaster about 12 feet long and weighing over 10 tons, quarried in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Not just any block, but one with veins and impurities that would give the finished work a realistic, antique look. Transporting it to Chicago was already an epic undertaking. Then he hired a sculptor of German origins, Edward Burckhardt, whom he told he wanted to create a statue of Abraham Lincoln. Of course, he lied through his teeth. Instead of Lincoln, Hull asked him to sculpt a man, naked, robust Jannart, with a pained expression and his hands on his private parts as if he were dying in agony. The expression and posture were studied to suggest death by asphyxiation, perhaps buried alive. The work took months of labor. To make the giant even more believable, Hull had Burckhardt use acids to age the plaster surface and hammers to tap it, creating fake pores and veins that would simulate the wear and tear of time and petrification. Small holes were even drilled into the surface, then filled with ink and damp sand to make it appear as if the giant had been underground for centuries, his pores filled with impurities from the soil. A classy touch, don't you think? Once finished, the giant was packed into a wooden crate and secretly shipped to the farm of Hull's relative, William C. Newell, near Cardiff, New York. Here, with Newell's complicity, the giant was buried in a strategic point of the property under a sort of mound, awaiting his grand debut. The precision with which it was buried was crucial. It had to be deep enough to look like an archaeological find, but not so deep as to make extraction too difficult or expensive. And then, the staging. It was October 16th, 1869. William C. Newell, Hull's cousin, staged the perfect discovery. He sent his workers to dig a well right on the spot where the giant had been buried months earlier. And surprise of surprises, the workers stumbled upon something hard and massive. Curiosity spread like wildfire through dry hay. They dug carefully and slowly, piece by piece, the giant emerged from the earth. It wasn't a work of art, it wasn't at all. It was a rough plaster statue, a bit crude, with a decidedly curious shape. But in that context, shrouded in mystery and fascination, it became something more. It became the Cardiff giant. The crowd immediately gathered. Imagine the scene. Men, women, children, peasants, and gentlemen in bowler hats all crowded around this newly excavated colossus. There was no internet, no television, but word of mouth was powerful. The news spread like wildfire, from village to village, from county to county, until it reached the big cities. People stared at him with wide eyes. He was enormous, petrified, and looked, for all intents and purposes, like a man, a gigantic man. It didn't take long for popular imagination to do the rest. It's a biblical giant, some shouted. Proof of the great flood, others replied. In the blink of an eye, the Cardiff giant was no longer a simple find. It had become an icon, a tangible confirmation of ancient myths and beliefs. Everyone wanted to see it, touch it, study it. No one wondered how a human body could be transformed into plaster or how it had arrived there so intact. No, the only thing that mattered was the emotion, the wonder, the thrill of being in the presence of something exceptional. The giant was left on display at Newell's farm, protected by a curtain, and immediately the demand to see it was enormous. Hull and Newell, with the most innocent air in the world, thought it best to charge a fee, at first a modest sum, like a quarter. But demand grew, and with it the price. Soon everyone was willing to pay to witness what they believed was the greatest archaeological discovery of the century. And here, my dear friends, comes the true evil genius, or if you prefer entrepreneurial acumen. The entrance fee quickly rose to 50 cents and then to a dollar. A dollar in 1869 was a considerable sum, but people paid. They stood in endless lines, endured uncomfortable journeys just to set eyes on that stone colossus that seemed to gaze upon the world with an expression of eternal wonder. The profit was stratospheric. Within weeks, the Cardiff giant was making thousands of dollars, but Hull wasn't satisfied. For him, it wasn't just about the money, but also about seeing how far human ingenuity could go. And as the media circus surrounding the giant grew, so too did the inevitable. Merchandise sales, Cardiff Giant souvenirs, plaster casts of the giant, postcards and prints of the giant. Anything bearing the giant's image was snapped up. People wanted a piece of the giant, literally. The demand was such that Hull decided to bring the giant to Syracuse, a larger city where he could accommodate an even larger crowd. There the giant was displayed in a specially constructed tent, and the flow of money showed no sign of abating. It was such a success that even P.T. Barnum, the legendary circus barker and king, whose name is synonymous with big show and high minded deception, took an interest in the affair. Barnum offered $60,000 for the giant for 6 months, but Hall and Newell refused. They were convinced they could earn much more on their own. Barnum, never one to give up easily, and especially never one to pass up a good deal, didn't lose heart. If he couldn't have the original, he'd create his own. And so he had an exact replica of the Cardiff giant made, calling it his petrified giant. And you know what the funniest part is? Barnum exhibited his replica in New York, and people flocked to see it, believing it to be the real thing. His giant was almost as successful as the original. This demonstrates not only Barnum's cunning, but also the depth of the public's naivete. It had become a competition to see who had the realest giant, and people were willing to pay to see both, or perhaps to decide which was the better one. Meanwhile, experts of all kinds came to examine the giant. Theologians, archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, each had their own theory. Some religious figures hailed it as irrefutable proof of the Bible. Scientists, more cautious, were divided. Some, like paleontologist O.C. Marsh, immediately dismissed it as a hoax, noting its rough surface, the lack of pores on the skin, and above all, the fact that it was made of chalk, not actual rock. But the voices of these skeptics were drowned out by the clamor of the crowd and the enthusiasm of the gullible. The masses preferred wonder to harsh reality. George Hull and his associates laughed, and how they laughed. They laughed until they cried, watching people mock their own intelligence, paying good money for an obvious lie. It was the perfect demonstration that sometimes people prefer to be deceived if the deception is spectacular enough. But as often happens, the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or unwanted it may be, has a nasty habit of surfacing. No matter how deeply you've buried a secret or a plaster cast, someone will eventually dig deep enough. In the case of the Cardiff giant, the cracks in the story were not just those artificially created in the plaster to make it look ancient, but they were also cracks in the claims and incredibility itself. The skeptics, the true scientists, and logicians did not give up. They had been mocked, ignored, but they continued to point out the inconsistencies. How could a petrified body maintain such a perfect shape, showing no signs of compression or alteration due to time and the weight of the earth? And why was it made of chalk, a relatively soft material, and not the granite or basalt rock typical of fossil finds of that magnitude? Professor O.C. Marsh of Yale University, a renowned paleontologist, was one of the first and most influential to expose the hoax. After examining the giant, he openly declared it to be nothing more than an excellent fraud. His reputation gave weight to his words, but for a while they were still isolated voices in the chorus of admiration. However, George Hull, our cunning cigar maker, wasn't one to keep secrets forever. Perhaps out of vanity, perhaps because the loot was already sufficient, or perhaps out of a latent sense of guilt, though I highly doubt it, given his character, he began to tell the story to those he trusted. And as we know, secrets, especially good ones, tend to travel. The first significant public confession came from one of the sculptors who had worked on the giant. A Chicago worker, John F. Boyle, who had participated in the creation of the Colossus, decided to come forward and tell the truth. He described the process, the materials, the workmanship. His testimony was corroborated by others who had handled the enormous block of plaster secretly transported. But the final confirmation, the final blow to mass credulity, came from George Hull himself. In December 1869, just 2 months after the giant's discovery, Hall publicly confessed the entire affair. He revealed that he had devised the scam to make money, but also to mock religious fanaticism and the credulity of the people who blindly believed biblical stories without any concrete evidence. He described in detail how he had purchased the block of chalk, how he had it secretly carved, and how he had buried it on his cousin's farm. Imagine the reaction. The people who had paid a lot of money, who had traveled for miles, who had defended the authenticity of the giant with all their might, felt humiliated, angry, and above all ridiculous. The biblical giant turned out to be a huge and rather hilarious hoax. News of the unmasking spread as quickly as the news of the discovery. The newspapers, which had previously hailed the discovery, now sarcastically headlined the Graveying as the Great Hoax. The crowds that had previously gathered to admire now gathered to protest or simply to laugh at their own collective naivety. The Cardiff Giant case quickly became a prime example of how mass hysteria and the desire to believe can overcome all logic and common sense. It was a severe blow to many, but also an important lesson in the importance of critical thinking and checking sources. And George Hull? Well, Hull was satisfied. Not only had he made a lot of money, but he had also proven his point. He had exposed the fragility of blind faith and the human tendency to believe what one wants to believe rather than what can be proven. And for a slightly bored cigar maker, it wasn't bad at all. The Cardiff Giant is still here, believe me. Sure, it doesn't make the headlines anymore and doesn't draw huge crowds. But his story? Oh, that lives on. Today, the original giant is preserved in the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, while Barnum's replica is displayed on the corner of the university's Marvin Gardens. It's a tourist destination for those who love historical curiosities and stories of ingenuity, or cunning, depending on your point of view. But beyond its physical presence, the Cardiff Giant remains a monument to human credulity, of course. How often do we let ourselves be fooled by sensational headlines, miraculous proofs, stories that sound too good to be true? The giant reminds us that the gullible are always lurking, ready to pay for a ticket to a new show, even if the script is patently false. It is also a monument to the ingenuity of a man, George Hull, a man who understood perfectly how the human mind worked, its weaknesses, its hopes, its fears. He exploited a specific historical moment, a thirst for wonder and validation, to create something that became iconic. His scam was far from trivial. It was a masterful deception, a marketing masterpiece ahead of its time. And above all, it's a constant reminder. Sometimes truth is much funnier than fiction. Because what's more hilarious than watching thousands of people, including professors and clergymen, earnestly debate the authenticity of a block of chalk carved by a crafty farmer? It's a human comedy that plays out in different forms even today. Every time a bombshell turns out to be a hoax, every time an illusion captures the imagination of millions, the Cardiff Giant smiles from his museum, his slightly pained expression as if to say, I told you that's just how you are. So, my dear friends, the next time you come across something incredible, something that promises you miracles or absolute truths, remember the Cardiff Giant. Check it out, but always keep an eye open and a healthy dose of skepticism in your heart, because doubt isn't cynicism, it's intelligence. Don't miss the next video to discover another absurd story.